In this Godot tutorial, I'll teach you how to make a stat system that allows your players to distribute stat points that they gain when they level up. Let's get started. In the last tutorial, we created this character sheet. In this tutorial, we'll be making this middle section, the stat distribution part, functional. The first thing we have to do is make sure that this character sheet loads in the same standard format every single time. To do that, I've done a couple of things to the bottom 4 stats already, which we'll be doing to the strength stat together. I've disabled or locked both the minus and plus buttons of these various stats, and I've emptied their labels for any changes or indication of changes the player has made. Let's do this together to the strength stat, and then we'll start coding. So let's first bring our strength stat in line with the other ones. We're going to select the minus button under the strength container and we'll disable it by default. We'll do exactly the same for the plus button and we'll remove the label +2 from the strength change indicator. With that done, our panel is completely standard and ready to be loaded. Now under the character sheet, I've already added the first lines of code. Let's go over them together and see what results this already gives us. First, on the top we have 2 variables. The first one defined onReady, and this is going to be the node reference to the label. That is going to be the 0.7 label, or the label indicating 0.7 right there. This is going to be our available stat points. I'm saving that in a variable because we'll need to be referencing that a couple of times, and otherwise it will make this line of code very long, several times in the script. For the same reason of keeping my lines of code short, I've saved the path main stat, that is this path, as the beginning path to the main stat. We'll need to go into the buttons and into the various labels under stats for several times in the code for several different statistics. To make sure that these lines of code don't go very long, I've copy pasted in the path that is shared between all stats as the sort of main container. So that is the entire path up till the main stats right there, and that's where the path towards the various nodes is going to divulge into strength, constitution, etc. So by saving that in a variable, we can keep the lines of code nice and short. Next we have 6 stats, 5 of which are for the various statistics, and this will be the additive. This will be the amount of change that the player has chosen to distribute its stats points over. Then of course we also have the available points, which was 7 in the hard-coded version, but I've changed it to 5 so we can see if our changes are actually working. Then under the ready function, we make the first couple of changes when the panel loads. First of all, we're going to take that node stat points that we defined on the top there, so our label, and we're going to set that to be equal to the string conversion of available points. So the integer 5 is converted into a string and we add space points. And then if the available points is 0, in other words the player has no points to distribute, nothing has to happen. All our buttons can remain locked. Else, if there are points to distribute, we want to get all the buttons in the node group plus buttons, and we want to set disabled to false, thereby enabling unlocking the buttons. Now we don't have a plus buttons group yet, so let's make that together now. With one of the stats selected, select the plus button over in node groups, define the label, add that label or add that group. Then by clicking manage groups and with plus labels selected, we can search all the other plus buttons that are all in their own stat background within their own stat container. We'll add all of them, and now they're all in a group indicated by this little square icon. Now if we play the game, we'll see, because we got 5 points, that now 5 points is selected there, or is visually represented there, and our plus buttons are now selectable where our minus buttons are not. Now with that set up, we can start programming in the code for these plus buttons after we've connected their signals up to the script. Now, to connect our buttons up to the script, you would expect they would go to a button, and under the inspector node signals, we would connect the pressed button up. But that's not what we'll be using in this case, because I want this signal to pass along an extra variable. And although that is possible through the pressed signal, I prefer to do that in code as it's much faster and convenient. So we're going to go to the script of character sheet. And under the ready function, we'll add the code for connecting our buttons. This is going to take exactly the same line of code as we have right there where we disable or enable the buttons. We're going to go for every button in nodes get nodes in group plus buttons. We're going to get that button and connect its pressed signal. So that's the same press signal you would normally connect through the inspector. We're going to connect to self to this script. The function that has to run when that signal is received is the increase stat function, which I've defined right there. And then as an extra variable, I want to know which button is pressed. Is it the plus of strength or the plus of dexterity? We need to know which plus is pressed to make sure that we can build a function that's able to define or differentiate between those different buttons. To do that, we're going to get the button node reference from the for loop. We're going to get the node parent of parent. Double dot means parent, so double dot forward slash double dot means parent of parent, and we're going to get the name. What this does is the node right here in the node tree plus is going to go to the parent, and then the parent of the parent, strength, and it's going to get the name of that node, which is strength. So now get name is going to retrieve the stat name and it's going to push that into increase stat. So this stat right here is going to be strength, intelligence, dexterity, etc. Then I have a quick print command here to test this out and demonstrate that this works. We do exactly the same for the minus buttons, but now we are going to be activating the function decrease stat. Now the minus buttons don't have their own group yet, so let's quickly go to the minus button node groups. Let's make this node, manage the groups, select minus button, make sure you find all the other minus buttons through the filter and add them to it. Now with that done, we can play this scene, and now we can see that in the editor output right here, when we click plus, we see strength plus, constitution plus, dexterity plus, intelligence and wisdom. The minus buttons are of course not functional because we have not enabled them, but they work in exactly the same way. Now let's code the behavior of the plus buttons to make sure that all is functioning as we desire. As our button needs to do a couple of things, I've created this template for you to follow along. First, we want to increase the stat add so that it's one of these 5 stats depending on which button is pressed. Then we want to update the change label that will be visual feedback to the player. Then we want to unlock the minus button so that the player can revert its choice as long as the player hasn't pressed confirm yet. Then we want to reduce the available amount of stat points, so this 5 needs to be reduced by 1 whenever a button for plus is pressed. And we want to also make sure that the player has the visual feedback that he actually added or spent a stat point by updating the appropriate label. Then lastly, if the available points become 0, we need to lock all the plus buttons to make sure that the player cannot overspend. So let's get started on the first 2 lines of code, making sure that we add that stat points to our additive stat. The first 2 behaviors that we'll be coding of this function also happen to be the more complex ones. Reason being is that this button get node get parent of parent get name is going to retrieve the name of, for example, strength. Strength, however, is not the same as strength underscore add, so we need to add that last part of the string to it. Not only that, strength in our variable reference is written with lowercase s. Strength in our node tree is written with a capital letter S. So there's 2 ways we can do this. We could either write a if or a match function, and we'll have to be copying the same code a couple of times over again, but I'm all against copying code in several places, especially for something relatively easy like this. So we're going to make use of a set and a get function. What we do is we first set a variable. This way you can call a variable not through the variable reference but through a string. So it requires the string or the property written in a string. For example, strength underscore add. Next, we can add a value to it, for example, 1. Now, of course, we don't have this strength add, so we first have to be changing this part. That part is going to be the stat that was retrieved and pushed to this function, and we need to convert it to lowercase using the toLower function. After that, we can add the second with the syntax plus, we can add the next part of the string, which is going to be underscore add. Now for 1, we need to make sure that we add 1 or plus 1 basically every single time the button for a certain stat is pressed. That means that we need to add plus 1 to whatever the value is currently. Now to get what the value is currently, we can use a get function, and we pretty much use exactly the same format as we do right there. We close the get, we plus 1 it, and now our set function is done. Now with the set function done, so that will be this behavior, we can now update the change label. We do that by pasting in a piece of code. Basically what we do, we're gonna get the node path to main stats, so that will be this part of the path. Then we use the stat that came into this function. That is of course the strength, this time with capital letter as we're building up a node path, plus the stat background stats change. That is basically up to this label or that node right there. We set that text, and that is going to be a plus with the string of get stat lower underscore add. So we use exactly the same get function as we used here. We convert that to a string. I'm adding a space to it to give it a little bit of padding. Now with that done, we should be able to press our plus button, and we see that this is changing, of course, both in the code as well as in the label. Now let's finish this function by adding in the last 4 behaviors. I'll be pasting them over while keeping our template text in here so you can follow along easily. First, we have to unlock the minus button. We do that by taking the get node. We again use the path to main stats and the stat reference, so we take the right container. We access or approach the minus button and set disabled to false, thereby enabling it, and the button is now pressable. Then we reduce the amount of available stat points by taking available points minus is 1, so that's going to take available points and subtract 1. Then we update the available stat points in the label by accessing the node stat points. That is the node reference we saved on the top. And we set that to string available points. After we've just changed it, now we can update it using that variable. Then, if the available points are 0, we need to lock all plus buttons. It's quite easy if we simply only have to run an if function, that if the available points is equal to 0, then for every button in get tree, get nodes, and group plus buttons, button set disabled to true. These last two lines are exactly the same as the 2 lines we set on the top here. The only difference is that here we set them to false, and now we set them to true. With this behavior coded in, we should now see a functional button that as soon as we press plus, we see that the minus button opens up. We will do it again here with constitution. That button is now clickable. Of course, it doesn't work yet, but we'll program that in a moment. We see the change label updating, and we also see our points being subtracted. As you can see, from 3 to 2, and then we see also that the change can handle several ones. As soon as I spend my last point, we see all the plus buttons disabling, making sure that the player cannot overspend any of the stat points. Now, let's switch our attention to the minus button so that we can also reduce them and bring back the stat points as long as we have not pressed confirm yet. For the decrease stat function for the minus buttons, we're going to go over it a little bit faster. It's almost the revert of the increase stat with a couple of minor tweaks that are very important for us. The first line of code is exactly the same. It is basically changing the variables on the top here, but in this case it's a -1 instead of a +1. then there's a difference, because when we look at the overview, the 2D view, when we press a plus button, the change label that's going to show +1, +2, +3 always has something to show, because when you press plus, it's always going to be +1 or more. When you press minus, at some point it's going to be +0, and we don't want to show +0, we just want to show nothing at that point. So we have to run that into an if function. So if getStat to lower underscore add is equal to 0, then we set that stat background stats change label set text to nothing. Also, what we do at the moment that amount is 0, we want to disable that minus button again, because you cannot deduct more points than you have temporarily added. Now, else, if that is not the case, if maybe you have pressed twice plus and you only press one time minus, making this case still a 1, then of course we simply want to set the text of that change label to whatever that stat currently is. So that function is going to be exactly the same as that function right there. Then we of course increase the available points +1, just like we decrease the available points with 1 over here. We of course have to give 1 point back. Then we update the label so the player gets the visual feedback that he got a point back. And then we unlock all the plus buttons. Reason why we do that is if you have spent all your points at one point, but decide to deduct 1 from your choice so far, then of course you need to be able to spend that point on any of the stats again. So we have to unlock or enable all the plus buttons again as soon as one of the minus buttons is pressed, as there will be a stat point to give. Now, if we test this out in the scene, we can now add these plus buttons. We can also minus them. And as you can see, if I've spent all my points, got 1 point left, all my plus buttons are now locked. If I press 1 times minus, they all unlock. If I minus 1 more, in that case it will be +0. The label disappears and the minus button locks itself again. Thereby the player can never overspend or re-roll stats at a point that should not be available. Now with this done, our buttons minus and plus are working correctly. Now whenever the player has made a choice, his mind is set, he wants to press the confirm button, and that's the moment that we want those stats to become permanent and fixed. So that is what we'll be programming next. Now when the player presses that confirm button, we want those values to change, but as I said at the beginning of this tutorial, these values 28, 35, etc. are currently hard-coded. These stats are supposed to reside on the player script and not on the script of the user interface panel, as they are inherently part of the player and not a user interface panel. So this is a good moment to connect everything together. Now, what I'll be able to show you now might be different in your game if you have already a project for yourself. If you don't have a project for yourself and you would like to make one, make sure you check out one of the other dozens of Godot tutorials I have on my channel, as everything you see on screen right here, from the health globes to the map to the enemies and the spells, are all tutorial content. Now, on here I have the graphical user interface canvas layer, which has all my user interface elements. This is where we want the character sheet to be added to, so that it pops up in front of everything else. To do that, we want to connect that to a button. We want to map that. So I'm going to go to project settings, and I'll create a new action called character sheet. Now with that action, we'll add it, and we'll add a key as the mapping to it. I think C is a good map for character sheet. Now with that closed, we can go into the code of the graphical user interface, and I've already added the code that is necessary to open and close the character sheet. What's happened is that the input event function is going to be listening to the isActionPressed character sheet. And if that action is detected, it's first going to verify if the character sheet is already added to the node or to the graphical user interface. If it has the node character sheet, or I should say if it has not got the node character sheet, we create a new variable, character sheet. We're going to load the scene that we have been working on this episode. We're going to instance it, and we'll add it as a child. Else, if the graphical user interface has the node character sheet, that means it's already open, then we're going to get that node and we're going to query free it away. That way we can now open and close the character sheet from our game. What more we need to do is we need to make the connection with the player script. To do that, we're going to go over to the script of the player. On here, I've already added the stat points. So we have strength and constitution up to wisdom, and I've purposefully changed 28 into 38 right here. So we can test out if this works. We can even change it to 48 just to test things out. We also have the amount of stat points that the player has available. I've set that here to 5, but let's change that to, and let's make it 9. Now, with that, we can go back to the character sheet. And maybe before we do that, we have to make sure that we understand how we can look this up, because once the character sheet has loaded, it's loaded under the graphical user interface. So we need to go up 1 parent to the graphical user interface, then up 1 parent to the map scene, then down to player. That is where the script of the player will reside and how we can access that. I've already made that reference on the top of the script here by saying on ready var player get node parent of parent player. So this is the character sheet we've been working on this entire tutorial, and I've added 1 more line to the 2 lines that were already on top here. Now, with that done, we can now say that the available points 5, the hard-coded points 5, can now be taken from the player script. So we're going to remove this is5, and we'll say when the node has finished loading into the graphical user interface, we'll say that the available points is player, and then I believe we called it stat points. Let's make sure that is correct. Stat points and stat points. That should be good. So now the available points are going to come out of the player script. As they come out of the player script, we also have to make sure that all the other things, strength, wisdom, intelligence, they also come out of the player script. So let's get working on that, and then we can program our confirm button. Now, to make sure that those stats from the player script are being pushed towards our character sheet, I don't want to put that in the ready function because I want to use it in 2 occasions. We want to load those stats up the moment the character sheet is opened, but we can reuse that code the moment the confirm button is pressed. So I'm going to put this in a separate function, and it's going to be called load stats, and we'll turn or play load stats on the top here of the ready script. This is going to retrieve the strength, constitution, dexterity containers that reside in the path main stat, that path right there, and we're going to set the value label to the set text turn into string player strength, where player is of course the node reference on the top right there. This way we're getting all of the stats into our character sheet. Oh, I cannot play the scene anymore because when I play only the scene, the player script is not accessible because it's not added to the graphical user interface, and this parent of parent doesn't work. So now we have to play the full game, and with the see that the map that we just mapped, we can now get the panel. Now we see that we got 9 points and we got 48 strength, just like we changed in the player script. Everything is still functional as it should be. Now we just have to make sure that the confirm button works. To program our confirm button, we first have to connect it up to the script. I've got the confirm button right here in the node tree, and under node signals, I'm going to go to pressed, and I'm going to connect this signal up to the character sheet. Then on the character sheet, we'll be adding in the code to make this all work. This looks like a lot of code, but there's a lot of repetition in here. The first line is a if statement that's going to verify if the confirm button is actually necessary to run any code. It's going to sum up all the stats, strength add, constitution add, etc. The same variables we got here that need to increase whenever we press a plus. And it's going to check if that's equal to 0. If that's the case, we know that the player has not distributed any stat points, and we can print there's nothing to confirm, and possibly, if you so desire to, you can even add your code for a little pop-up in here to tell the player he needs to distribute some stat points first. Else, if this is not 0 and thus the player has distributed some stat points, we're going to take the player's 6 variables, 5 stats and the stat points. We're going to set the stat points equal to the available points that are left on this script. And for the stats, we're going to plus is, so we're going to add the strength add, constitution add, etc. variables. Then, of course, we want to make sure that those variables, strength add all the way up to wisdom add, are set back to 0. If we don't do this, it would mean that the player can continue to press the confirm button and continue to add those stats to its player stats. Thereby, he will be able to cheat the system. So we need to set this back to 0. After that, we of course want to make sure that the stats, the +2, +3, are taken up into the main stat, the 48 for example. To do that, I'll be recycling the code we just made under the function load stats. Because we have now changed the stats on our player script by reloading this function, as I said we would reload this or recycle this, we are now setting our labels to whatever they need to be. That way we can recycle that piece of code, we don't have to do that again. Lastly, we of course want to make sure that all the minus buttons, and some of these minus buttons are going to be unlocked because stat points are currently distributed. We want to make sure that all those minus buttons are locked again so that the player cannot redeem any skill points or stat points the moment he has pressed confirm, as those choices are usually final. Then lastly, we're going to take every single label that is a change label, so it's going to be the +2, +3, +1, and we set them back to 0. Now, of course, this is a get note in group change labels piece of code, and we don't have this yet. So I'm going to be copying this, I'm going to be navigating to one of our change labels, and under node groups, I'll be adding this label into a group. I'll manage my group, I'll select my change labels, and I'll filter for change and add the other 4 to it. This way the code is able to access all those change labels and set them back to 0. Now we can test it out. Okay, right now I'm in the game. I'm going to press C to open up the panel, and we right now have 48 strength with 9 points. If I were to add 2 of the points right here and hit confirm, you can see now it is on 50 and our minus button is now locked. Our plus button is still open because we got 7 points more to spare. If I were to close the panel, pressing C and reopen it, it would simply load those 7 points and 50 strength from the player script, as that's where we saved them in this game session. We're not saving those stats yet to a player save file, but that's what we'll be adding in the future. Now I can add more points, I can remove some points if I feel like that was a bad choice, and I can end up with spending all my points. By confirming, I'm changing my main stats, and now both my minus buttons and plus buttons remain locked as I have 0 points to distribute. Now, of course, we want to make sure that we get some skill points when we kill some enemies, and we're about to hit level 8 here. So let's code in one line on the player script to make sure that we're rewarded some stat points whenever we level up. So to do that, I'm going to go back to our map scene, going to go to my player, going to go to my player script, and under my player script, there's quite a lot of functions here, but let's close a couple of these up. I have my level up function, which is going to be hit while my experience is higher than is necessary. And under my level up, I can simply say my stat points. If you decide in your game you want to, for example, reward the player with, shall we say, 5 stat points? 5 stat points whenever he levels up. Now our stat points are being updated in the stat points, which is now taken over to our character sheet. Let's quickly play this again, see if this all works. We know that we had 9 stat points. That is not saved because I've unloaded and loaded the game session. So now if we walk up to our skeletons, they have no match for me. I'll kill them. We're now level 8 with just 50 out of 800 experience. When I open the panel now, we see we got 14 points instead of the 9 that we had, completing the complete cycle of stat points and giving you a full stat system. Now, in future videos of this player development series, we'll be taking a look at the stats on the right side of the panel. Hit points, attack, defense. These are stats that the player actually takes into combat and from which combat calculations will be run. We of course want the player to get more hit points if he chooses to invest in constitution, or more attack if he chooses to invest in strength. And maybe you want some hit points to be given to your player, maybe +5 or +10, whenever he levels up, regardless of how he chooses to spend his stat points, and give the possibility to invest extra into hit points whenever he chooses to go for constitution, for example. Those kind of formulas we'll be looking at in future episodes in this player development series, along with of course our most expected skill tree, skill points and skill system. That's all up for the future. That was it for today. That was it for today, guys. Hope you like it. If you did, smash that like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget that little bell icon to make sure that you don't miss out on the next video in this player development series. If, as always, you're curious about the game development that I do myself, my own personal projects, I live stream every Tuesday and Thursday on Twitch, where I welcome you to join a big group of Godot game developers that watch, chat and learn Godot all together. The link and the schedule are down in that description box below. I hope to see you there one day, and until then, keep on gaming, keep on coding. See you later, guys.